My name is Bill Heyman. I run an executive search firm that specializes in the area of corporate communications and public relations. And along with my colleague, Jamie Wernette, we want to thank the Planck Center for its support of these important leadership studies, particularly Juwan, Bruce, and Carla. I just have a few quick comments to make before asking Ansgar, Rod, and Bruce to make comments. And that is that, so Heyman Associates will be 24 years old this December. As a practical matter, if I start by saying that when we first started, the first year we were in business, the average compensation package for a communicator we were placing was around $72,000 a year. Today that number is $320,000. The point being is the profession has grown and grown in a very significant way. More of these jobs are reporting to the CEO. There's a far greater value put on the function, and you could argue that the digital and social revolution have been a gift from the communications gods for all of you as communications professionals. Now, to just put in context also about what I just mentioned about compensation packages in this business and the fact that there is real demonstration of the value of the function. From our standpoint as an executive search firm, the firms that we tend to compete with, when we first started in the business, one of the large generalist firms, that means firms that do all sorts of search work, not just in communications, but in general management, finance, research and development, one of those firms had a corporate communications capability. Today, every one of the top 6 executive search firms, global executive search firms, have that. Now, some people say, how do you feel about the competition? My response to that is always, you don't want to be in a business where there isn't competition. But the reality of it is it just demonstrates just how valuable what it is that you all do, it means to the workforce. Obviously, we were quite pleased to hear that attracting and retaining top talent is a critical component of these leadership studies. And so what I would like to essentially do is just ask Ansgar, Rod, and Bruce to make a few comments about what they got out of this afternoon, especially as it relates to what their other colleagues had to say. So Ansgar, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks. I think it was really interesting, helpful, and two issues which came up to my mind, which are related not only to our study, but to other research and discussions within the industry in Europe. One is what was mentioned in the last study by Bruce. So, an obstacle in many countries, probably in Asia and also in Eastern Europe, is a lack of leaders who demonstrate a vision of communication as a management function. And as long as this is not there, it's very difficult, on the one hand, to have educators and programs who go into this direction. They will stay on a more creative level. And on the other hand, it's obviously also difficult to show the value in the company, because in the end, it's the respect of others on the same level on the office CEOs to do that. And if we reflect what had happened in Germany in the last 20 years, and I started with a PhD in business administration, and when we had the first contacts with communication people, we were at a management department, we thought, what that, They were really up their own people, and they were heads of communication of large companies. And it really has changed so a lot, because a lot of people who came in, who are now these global CCOs whom we interviewed, probably don't have a communication study background, because there was none 20 years ago, if you're now 50 or so. But they moved in, and they have really a management approach, and that has changed dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years, and we couldn't have these interviews and attracted those people working together with research 10 years ago. And that's only Western and Northern Europe. We see it slowly emerging in Southern Europe and not really in Eastern Europe. And I think that's one of the main challenges, to identify those people in the corporate world, not only in the agency world. In the end, it's the corporate world which counts, because they have to have the budget, the internal respect for that. And that leads to the second impression I got. It's also, I think it's in every study, because if there's a lack of showing leadership, the question is, why is it there? Probably it's a question of focusing on educating, not educating only students, but educating all levels. And what we see is that really focusing on different set of competencies, on the path, how you can make a career. Because if you started 20 years ago, a lot of people now complain you can fire half of your department because there was no real further education. But you can't always hire only younger people. It won't work. It won't work in 10 years and 20 years if you look at the demographics in some of the Western societies. So what we now see is some of the large companies, and we're working on a new research project with some of the blue chip companies like Siemens or Deutsche Bank on that, is a program on how to develop a full set of competencies, how for your whole communication department, and competency doesn't mean roles or profiles of different jobs, but really aspects of competencies, and you start probably like exactly what you said, Bruce, the more creative people, but then you need management and leadership probably 2 or 3 years later, and some of them will move out of communication more in another function, and some will come back. And thinking of that on a large scale, I think that's the next challenge really for global leaders and they have to interact with human resources, they have to interact with other people who did that, for engineers and for business administration people. And so I see a big picture which is emerging, and I think it's very important for different cultures and to go onto this path. And I think at the moment that some Western companies are leading the path, but I think if you manage that game, you will be able also to work on a global level.
I think communications training is a big question. I wanted to make this as participative as it could be, although we are constrained a little bit by time. Does anybody want to comment on that issue, on the training issue or anything like that? Sure, yeah. Yes?
I think one thing underway that might address that is kind of going in the other direction. If we don't have enough trained communication leaders, maybe we can help train some of the business executives so that they understand what communication is and the importance in terms of a management function. And I think that's been an effort of a special group within PRSA, and I think it's been quite successful, and they're ready to roll it out to many more universities.
Great. Rod?
Well, first of all, the light is so bright, I'm expecting an aggressive question from Reuters at some point. Press conference. However, it's not.
You're our lone nut.
Worked that one out. Thank you for the kind words. I think that, the one thing that really stood out for me was this idea of sense making, because I think implicit a lot of the work that we're doing and thinking about is this idea that whether it's us or those we advise, that the advent of big data, which compounded the nature of 24/7 media, people talk about VUCA, velocity, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. Everyone is pretending they know how to manage this, and I don't think anyone has cracked it yet. And I think there needs to be, a degree of honesty between leaders and those they advise, that actually no one is that good, no one has mastered it yet. IBM's CEO study, had leaders being able to manage complexity as the #1 attribute, along with forming partnerships. So I think this sense of sense-making, absolutely critical. Honesty that no one's cracked it, I think that's a fascinating area. I think the other one is this, this sort of possible tension between the work that looks at leadership of the function and then looks at the interaction of the function and leadership, which was, the sort of dichotomy we were dealing with today. And I think to the point about, you hear a lot of people saying we need to educate the C-suite, as if the C-suite are getting something wrong and we have the moral intellectual high ground. Part of the reason we're doing the thinking we're doing about Decide, Act, Engage is that as long as PR keeps speaking the language of PR, then the C-suite isn't necessarily going to suddenly get it. And why should they? We live in our world, our bubble, we talk a bit in our language. I think there has to be this change whereby we start having a dialogue with the C-suite that shows value on their terms. Because after all, that's what we'd say to any client, be it internal or external. You want to change hearts and minds, you've got to do it in terms of the audience. It's basic comms theory. So I think that, if there is a challenge within the industry of talent and leadership talent, how we work out a way of closing that gap in a way that then helps with the overall leadership deficit, I think, then we can go home. I think we're done.
Yeah. We frequently talk at Heyman Associates about what our clients are frequently asked to what our clients are seeking. And to your point, Rod, the understanding of business is point number one. I mean, you could almost not be as good a communicator, but if you understand the business, you're a lot further ahead in actually being able to have that kind of interaction with the C-suite. Bruce?
Research is circular. You start out with hypotheses, or you start out with research questions. You go through, you do the research, you gather the data, analyze it, and in the end, for me, I'm always still left with questions. Not the original questions necessarily, but related questions. So my comment really is sort of tied to 5 questions. And the first 2 are interrelated, and that is 1, who's listening? And 2, what stops us from moving from knowing what's needed to doing what's needed in leadership? My point here is that if I look back through, and I've highlighted some things in the presentations, there's a thread, a common thread that runs through, I think, these 3 data sets. Let me just highlight a few things. Open, transparent communication, number 1 attribute of effective leaders. Ability to build and inspire teams, right out of transformational leadership theory. Trustworthiness, the importance of that. From Ansgar's study, the reputation of the CEO, it's important in communicating with employees. An increasing need for CEOs to show personal presence. What our studies did was confirm the importance of those. They didn't discover them, they confirmed. So the big question for me always is, we know this stuff, our leaders know this stuff, why don't we act on it? So the real question is, what are the barriers that get erected, and how do we tear those down? Our new CEO is going to be more enlightened. We're talking about changing communication professionals and leaders. Our new CEOs, younger CEOs, more enlightened and communicate and orient. Should we, as Ansgar suggested, should PR play a greater role in developing competencies? Forget the C-suite. Actually, one of the interesting things I didn't get into in our study was C-suite actually seemed to have a pretty good understanding of PR. The problem was other executives, and particularly mid-level managers and frontline supervisors, were a great need for communication skills and understanding was present. So overall, some food for thought, some questions to think about later. Overall, what specific role should public relations play, if any, in terms of taking on some responsibility for bringing communication competency, teaching it, reinforcing it with frontline supervisors and mid-level managers? 2, what are those key competencies? And actually, I think Rob's study and the global study both give us some good markers for content there. And 3, how does this become a priority in a profession where top priorities change even on a daily basis?
One of the things I love about doing what I've done for quite some time is communicators' ability to take what I think is complicated material and reduce it to language that people can understand. And so it came as no surprise to me when Bruce came up with the term sense-making. I also loved Rod's term, long-termist. I thought that was a good term to describe something that we all need to consider. I will end it here by saying that I thought when Ansgar was talking about CEO reputation, it hearkened to clients we've had that have said we need the communications person to come in and help position a CEO, especially a CEO who is not a natural communicator, a CEO that might be an introvert, a CEO that might come out of operations and not necessarily been the most charismatic person in the succession line for their job. And yet, that folds in quite well with what Rod said about the decline of the muscular CEO. But I think when we think about just how critical the communications function is and what role it can play in helping companies be able to articulate their vision and their mission, if you take that from our way of thinking about it, if you take the data that you now have access to that you didn't previously, and you fold into what I would argue would be good intuition and good judgment. And you can't, I don't believe for a minute you cannot have all those things. In other words, you can't just be data-driven without having the judgment and the intuition, the ability to be able to work closely with the CEO and have the likability and the winningness to be able to work in those relationships.
Bill, can I just build on something that Bruce said? I thought your point about a lot of this confirmed rather than discovered. When I was talking to someone about this, presenting, someone said, well, doesn't this tell us what we know already? And I was glib, and I said, well, that's because it's social science research. We haven't discovered the neutrino. We're not, we haven't found a new particle. We have redescribed something that exists. But what's interesting is at Harvard, they define leadership as sustainable excellence that endures beyond you. And they say that an opportunity comes from identifying a change of context and then aligning resources to it. And I think what's important about all of this put together is it is starting to realise that there is a change of context around the notion of leadership within the function and in relation to those they advise. And I just think merely redefining the context in itself is a really important step. And that for me is the red thread between the three.
Anybody have any questions before I turn it back over to Frank?
I'll just make a comment, and I want to go back to the dancing leader video to do so. We talk about, we're so into, in our society, and clearly increasingly in Europe as well from the research, the CEO is superstar. The one who ought to be the great communicator. If he's not the great, he or she is not the great communicator. And now we're starting to talk about the public relations leader in the same way, as opposed to real leadership is distributed. The CEOs that produce extraordinary returns over a long period of time are more likely to have come from that organization, to be fairly self-effacing, to really make everybody else the stars, to welcome that second and third and fourth dancer. And so, I hope that and I don't think I've heard anything that says, well, we can't consider leadership to be that broader sense of it's the organization and its many leaders. But I also maybe we ought to define terms like training, which to me is a much lesser term than education or the real knowledge of what's going on around you. You cannot train people to dance like that. It just doesn't happen. So I hope we don't, and maybe that's future research, this broader sense of it isn't just an individual superstar. It really has to be an organization that thinks that.
Training is a little piece of it. Probably the most appropriate term that I've seen is leadership development.
Yeah.
Which is about a whole series of phases and types of experiences and activities that one goes through over time and becomes a better leader.
Yeah.
Not a rock star, but a better leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I think the superstar or the charismatic leader, also in our study, is clearly not there anymore, because you saw, I didn't present it in detail, then these different countries or cultures, different approaches are necessary. So you simply can't do that. So that ends up as a solution, and only a few companies do that, a lot of much more applied research. You have to have profiles for the whole board, and probably different profiles, different countries, and then you have to position different people in different contexts. So I know at least one or two companies, only in Germany, but not of the study, who really do that, and they really have invested a lot in reputation research. And that match that with public opinion research, and then they get some idea, and then still it's a question what to do with the data and work on that. But that means that the whole issue of a charismatic leader looking for that doesn't work, because also management teams are not only one leader, they have different people for different communities. I think that's the only way to tackle the issue in a fragmented world, because if you think of the personal presence on the one hand and the global presence of a company and people are the same, it simply can't work if you only have one. And just to add on that, and that's exactly business thinking, because it's a thing about risk. It's about how to spread risk, about different issues and about different leaders who might leave the company or fail or whatever. But I only see that in really very, very few CCOs who work on that. And it's quite interesting because it's really much research driven and much more strategic than that we see on the outside. And you have no campaign, no PR award about that. You only feel about, if you talk to these people in these interviews, what's really going on in some of those heads of really strategic communication leaders.
But I think your thing about training is very interesting. This isn't semantics. The word training presupposes I have and know some stuff that you need to know, and I'm damn well going to get into your head. By the end of today, you'll be as good as I am. And I think it's a completely flawed way of thinking about development. And I think, I went to a leadership summit in London, which was basically a series of people there to sell their book and their model. And if you follow my model, and if I ever write a book on this stuff, my introduction will say, whatever you do, don't follow this book, because I don't know it all. Bill George's true north. That's kind of the territory you want to be in. Is that you can only be a great leader if you learn on your terms, as opposed to having it done to you. So I have a problem with the word training massively, actually.
Cheryl?
And I certainly think that for leadership development or training to occur and be effective, we're talking also about creating a culture where this kind of coaching and learning and development is appreciated, not only in the C-suite, but throughout the organization. So I'm just wondering, are we suggesting that the role of the Chief Communications Officer is to also start to lead the dance for the change in culture? Or where does that really live?
I think, to respond to that, Bill, I think I use the term change agent today, and that's sort of how I've seen it. But it's the notion of pushing back on restrictive practices or policies or approaches in organizations that in some way are unfair or detrimental to others in the organization, which is, in effect, to say, to change the culture, to make it one that's more open and transparent and so forth.
Sure.
So I think, I personally, and this is personal, this isn't based on research, I personally have long felt that that's part of the communication officer.
I agree with you.
Mark?
Bruce, one of your fourth points in your presentation was that leadership development is underdeveloped in public relations. And I wonder if you or others on the panel feel that one reason for that might be that the profession is often focused on the technical competencies of communications and not focused enough on the interpersonal skills and the leadership skills required to be an effective CCO or agency head.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It just sounds like an advert for Omnicom, our parent, and it's not. But the level of investment goes in at a senior level, in fact, all levels, to training. I've just said the word training, having said I hated it. To learning, to professional development is remarkable. There's a thing called the Omnicom University, where we go off to Babson College and are taught by the Harvard Business School for 5 days, and then we go back a year later, then we go back 3 years later. And I think the level of underinvestment in leadership and management skills as opposed to craft skills is absolutely remarkable. And the Babson training is basically, how do you feed and water yourself as a human being? How do you lead? Don't give me more on how to write a press release. I think I can do. You know what I mean? You've got to think about people as individual leaders as opposed to functional delivery vehicles.
So I would fully agree. It's simply in the practical stuff. You have in large organizations, obviously, leadership programs. We talked to some of these blue chip companies about this competency project. The problem is, if you only have at Siemens or Daimler, you only have 15 people in a year who come in. The chance that someone from the communication department gets in, simply because of numbers, is not so high. So, and there's not something specific for them. So they end up, and obviously invest into their people, these large companies, but they end up in going to a course on digital media or whatever, and some of them obviously then go to, we see that all these leaders whom he interviews have had these extra training, but it was not focused on their jobs. They got to a 5 days Harvard Business School or London Economic School meeting. It was okay for them, but it was not then really related to their own business. And obviously the communication function is not so large that there is really an opportunity, both in-house or outside, to have a more adjusted course. You find that for engineering, you find that for others, and I think we have other functions like human resources, like law, where there are similar problems. They're also large enough to get some specific things, but they are not really on the leadership level at the moment good enough, and I think there's some development here, because the lack of human resources, at least in Western countries and companies, is so clear that they're going to work on that.
I think this is a huge point, because in our 24 years in business, I've probably had 20 former Fortune 500 chief communications officers that have come to us and said, would you be interested in hiring me to have Heyman Associates offer a coaching capability? And my comment is always, the reason the answer to that is no is because we don't have clients that are seeking to coach the communicator. Number one, when we do the search, they don't expect us to find somebody that needs coaching. Unrealistic as that may be, they're thinking they're going to get the perfect person. And the second piece is exactly what I was saying, that the function, it's absolutely making its way to the C-suite, but we're still not at a place where they will look at the chief communications officer and say, this is one of the key people on my leadership team, and therefore I want to train them to make sure they absolutely can run this show at some point in time. Because you don't have that many chairmen or CEOs of companies that came out of this function. You're getting more, but it's still, it's an issue. Ron, I don't want to hold us, I know there's probably some more questions. But
Any other questions? We have plenty of time.
do we?
Okay.
We've done by 5.
Okay, so then I have a question.
Oh, that's great, I didn't realize that. I'm-
You know, because I think this is a really critical area for us when we're talking about leadership in public relations, is how do we get on that list of high potentials? You know, when the C-suite sits around with the HR executive and start, you know, doing that list of who are the high potentials in our organization, you know, maybe that's a piece of research where we learn why is it just we're not in the room or we're invisible? Why is it that we're never considered for that list? And I said it was a question.
Yeah, I think it leads back to what we had before. You need some leader in the company who takes the opportunity. So talking of another company of an anecdotal staff, a new CEO came in and he started really to change his communication team very simply. He said, we stop thinking of the stakeholder stuff. You're doing that obviously. We have to understand that we are business partners, an old model, let's say. And he started just for half a year, just taking to his 80-person team based in Germany and the US. Everybody had to identify his business partner internally. He worked on that for 1 year, and this network building within the company was so strong that in the next 2 years he managed to put exactly that, 2 of his let's say, search tire people about 35 in this program who always applied, never did that, because they were only formally. They had the informal network, they were recognized, and then they were in. So it was a very simple, traditional thing. If you don't build your networks, if you don't have a strong leader who knows other leaders, then you will never go over this internal wall. But the question is, why did it work? Because they hired this guy, and this was an external guy. He even wasn't. He was a journalist, but not a journalist traditional sense, but he was working at a public broadcaster in a management position, had this background, and he was hired by a large German company with international operations. But he has a fresh view, and he worked on that because probably in the public broadcast they had this political feeling how to deal with these internal stakeholders. And it worked out, and it didn't work out for 20 years before.
So maybe the question really is, how do we start that revolution?
Yeah.
Because certainly having that champion in that case
Yeah.
worked, but if
Yeah, in
it's
other
one
words,
in
yeah,
every,
okay.
you know, 200,000.
Depends on ourselves, that's my
Yeah.
saying, it's that ourselves, it depends on current leaders. If they don't take the initiative, it's difficult to have structures and future leaders.
We were having this conversation at the break, and I think part of it is about the skill set that PR people have, which funnily enough tends to be PR, as opposed to knowing how a company works and how a company makes money. With the exception of financial comms and IR people, how many PR generalists, be they at the corporate end of the spectrum or the marketing end, genuinely understand how a company makes money, can genuinely read an analyst report, can genuinely dissect a P&L or a balance sheet, and I include myself in that to some degree, because you come through a different path. You rise through the ranks because of your PR skills. All of a sudden you're surprised that you're not on that short list, because guess what? You don't understand business well enough. And I think, you know, our Washington office is running this course called How Our Clients Make Money, which they're doing from account exec up, and we're going to be rolling that out because it was a light bulb moment for me. How can we possibly, aspire to advise at the highest level if we don't necessarily get it. So I think it's about our skill set and our mindset as opposed to.
I think these are all really important offshoots of the question that Mark asked, when he talked about known for tactical skills, known for being able to do things at a tactical level. And to your point, Charlie, I think exactly what you said, right? I think that if somebody were to say to me, what are our clients looking for in hiring a chief communications officer, they're going to assume the communication skills. They're going to assume all the tactical stuff. So they want this person to understand the business, and they want this person to have a reputation of doing great work.
And on that note, let's thank our panel. When I said we had plenty of time, you know, the bar does not open at the Union League Club until 6. So I'm thinking, I don't have to get over there until 6, but some people have to change clothes and get prettier. And so some people will be exiting, I think they have. And they also have some duties over there. So anyway, I just want to make sure that you don't think anyone is being rude. They have jobs to do. I also wanted to ask on those forms that Bill referenced that you have in front of you. The Planck Center a couple of years ago made a decision that we used to put out RFPs for research. And we just give us an idea of what you'd like us to consider funding that you would like to do some research. And we got some really good, but mostly bad ideas. So we decided that rather than get those, and we had to spend a lot of time reviewing all of these applications, that what we would do is we'd change our funding philosophy, that we will determine the kind of research that we want to do, and then we seek out people for that we think are very capable, and then we cut out kind of the competition for that assignment. So we'll determine who's the best person to do it, and let's see if we can get him or her to do it. So for instance, Cheryl's idea might be a good, worthy suggestion for research studies. So on that paper that Bill handed out, on that form, do you have some ideas after what you heard today from these takeaways that we had in the discussion? Jot it down. You know, I'd love to see more research done in this area of public relations. And that would be a big help to us because we'll take it up at the board meeting and look through all of the suggestions. So just a thought that comes to mind. Most of you, I think, are going to the mentorship award center this evening. Anyone who's not, we've had 3 cancellations in the past couple of hours, so let me know. We'd love to have you there. It's been sold out for the last several weeks. It's going to be a phenomenal crowd, and if you do not have already made plans, come as you are. And then, as promised at the very beginning, Al has been listening, and he is going to generously share his top-line thoughts on his takeaways from what he heard, and importantly, talk about the importance of research in public relations. When I started, and I'm sure when Al started, research was something we never did. I remember putting in a request in a budget, and I won't tell you what company that I was working for at the time, and I said, I want 1% of our overall public relations budget to go to research, to make sure what we're doing is important and to determine whether or not the organization is properly perceived, et cetera. 1%. And my boss came back and said, that is a total idiotic idea. I hired you for your instincts, and that's all that matters. So the pressure was on. I survived, but I really could have benefited from research. Fortunately, that's not the case today. And Al and his organization and all of the major public relations agency rely on research. And we'd love for him to reflect on what he's heard today and what's going on in his organization. Al.
Okay, thank you. First of all, after hearing all those salaries that Bill was talking about, I'm going to see him outside with my resume. Not too late, is it?
You're doing great work.
Okay, good. No, it was very nice to be with you and hear all this, and it's really been fascinating. A couple of years ago, I was at a board meeting, and one of the guys on the board of this not-for-profit was a CEO of a major company, one of the biggest companies in the world. And that day, there was a story that broke on a crisis that came about with his company, product tampering in Europe. And I said to him, I assume you'll be heading over to Belgium the next day or so. And he said, well, why would I want to do that? And I said, I don't know, I thought that, this is a pretty serious thing with your company, that you might want to be there. And he said, oh, no, it'll blow over. He said, these things always blow over. Well, long story short, he lost his job with the company. And I think that many boards of directors are remiss in not selecting a CEO who has communication skills, because I think that should be part and parcel of their job description. Too many of them don't. This particular guy was a CFO, and he was kind of shy, and he didn't like the whole idea of speaking even before any kind of group. And it was obvious that he couldn't handle this kind of a situation. So I think that that's the buck, I think, really, you all talked a couple of minutes ago about the thing tampering down to middle management and things of that nature, and I think that's a point, but I think the buck stops at the CEO's desk. And I think the tone of the company is really set by that individual. When I give a talk, invariably a couple of young people always come over to me after the talk, and they say, they always ask me, how do I convince my boss that what I do is really important, and the function is really something that they ought to take more seriously? And I give them an answer that usually they don't like, and I usually tell them to quit the company they're working for, because I don't think they're going to be able to sell that individual on the thing if they don't really have that aptitude towards it. So it's, I think it's really that kind of a thing more than anything else. When Ron asked me to say a few words about research, I couldn't resist talking about this situation though first. When we started, we relied completely on our gut instincts, because nobody ever heard of doing research for what we did. And if it seemed to work, we kept doing it over and over again. So, and I don't want to put down the gut feelings, because I think even today, with research and with all the technology we have, I think your gut sometimes is still very important to trust. Because I've always, somebody once asked me, what are you most proud of and what are you least proud of that you've done? And I always say that I'm most proud of when I stick to my guns, when I know that the idea is right, and I don't listen to all the naysayers who will tell me why it shouldn't work. And I'm the least proud when I'm talked out of a good idea that I know is right. And I think so the gut instincts are still very important to have. But having said that, we spend a lot of time and money these days on research, because it really makes more sense, especially today when the clients and companies are more sophisticated. In the early days of our business, when things got tough and the economy fell off, the first thing to go was public relations. We were very easily let go in those days, because it was always one of those things that was nice but not necessary. And fortunately today, Bill talked about the importance of the function, and that's really true. I think that we are taken seriously, because I think we back up with a lot of our gut instincts with good, solid research. We landed a very major company very recently, and the client said to us, you really came up with ideas that were based on what our customers really want. And you backed it up with solid numbers that we never had before. And this was a major company. You would have thought that they had access to everything, you know. They had a big research department of their own. But we did some things that were really above and beyond. And I think that today you have to back up your ideas with this good, solid research that we talked about. So it's a very important topic, and I'm glad to be here, and you don't want to hear any more presentations up here today.
Thank you very much, Al. It's an honor that you joined us. We really appreciate those remarks, Al.